This is a conversation with Paul Scharre, a researcher and probably the world's #1 expert on the increasingly important topic of autonomous weapons. Machines that are able to operate completely on their own, hunting down and eliminating enemies without being remotely controlled by anyone, and that make life and death decisions without any human input at all. As sci-fi as it sounds, this technology already exists. It is slowly being tested in conflicts like in the Ukraine war, and it will almost certainly completely transform how warfare and war itself looks like in the near future. And so we talk about all of that. From autonomous drones in Ukraine, the challenges and risks of giving up control over life and death decisions, to how much longer do human soldiers actually have left on the battlefield before becoming completely replaced by robots. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful, and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes, and additional bonus content. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, we're going to be talking about, obviously, your topic of expertise, about which you wrote and spoke and thought about probably more than almost anyone else in the world, which is autonomous weapons and AI and its use in military technology, which both of those are very closely intertwined today. And I think that's a topic that most people probably don't know that much about and don't think about very often. So I think it would make sense to kind of start by giving people idea of where this technology actually is today, because I think most people probably don't know what is still, the sci-fi idea of all of this, and what is already the reality, and what is maybe the near future that we're walking into. And I probably imagine that a lot of that is changing very fast, especially today. So could you maybe start by giving an idea of what is the actual level of autonomous technology, of autonomous weapons technology today, as is maybe on more of a standard level that's actually in use by major militaries, and then what is the real cutting edge of this tech today, something that's already a reality, that already exists, but that it's maybe just being tested and slowly implemented, that will really see roll out in the coming years.
Sounds great. Well, very excited to be here and have this conversation with you and share some of this with everyone. So I think maybe it's worth starting off and just talk about conceptually when we talk about an autonomous weapon. Like, what do we mean? Because the term gets used differently by different people. And I think conceptually the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's the idea that out in warfare, out on the battlefield, a machine is making a decision about whom to kill. That's conceptually the idea, and it's pretty simple in that respect. What gets blurry is when you start looking at the particulars of how autonomy or automation is used in warfare. It's not quite so clear-cut sometimes. And so an analogy I'll make here is to self-driving cars. So when we look at cars, we see lots of cars that are adding automation incrementally. Automatic cruise control, automatic braking, self-parking, and then you have full self-driving systems that have varying degrees of autonomy. You might have a Tesla that is a human, but the machine can drive for a period of time. You might have like a Waymo taxi. There's no one there in the seat at all, but it's very geographically limited in what it can do. And similarly, in weapon systems, militaries are incrementally adding automation in lots of different functions. So there's a lot of different, just like in driving, if you it seems simple, right? Like, put your hands on the wheel, foot's on the accelerator or the brake, you drive the car. When you sort of break it down, there's a whole bunch of different aspects of driving. There's staying between the lines, there's braking, so you don't have a car in front of you, there's parking, there's a lot of different dimensions. Similarly, militaries are sort of breaking out engagement decisions about, is this a valid target? What is this object that I'm looking at through, say, a drone video feed? Is that a tank? Is it a person? If it's a person, is it an enemy person? Who is it? Is it a valid target? Should I make a decision about going ahead and attacking this target? What weapon to use? Militaries are sort of breaking this out incrementally. So we're not at a place where militaries are using autonomous weapons that can go out and search for and find and attack enemy targets all on their own on the battlefield today. All that technology does exist. So it's really a question of military sort of putting it together. And is it valid? Is it useful for militaries? What are the kind of pros and cons of that? There are some limited exceptions, which we can get into more detail if you're interested, but things like air and missile defense systems. Well, that's a place where at least 30 countries do have air and missile defense systems that have fully automatic modes that a person can activate. And if there's a missile coming in or a rocket or artillery shell, and it meets the programming characteristics that the system has been told this is a threat, boom, if it's activated, that weapon system will shoot it down all on its own. But that's like a really limited domain. And so sort of the question at hand for militaries, frankly, for all of us, is when a Predator drone gets as much autonomy as a self-driving car, are we comfortable with these machines making life and death decisions? And what are the consequences of that? And that's really the question that's at hand for us as a society to wrestle with.
Right. And I think the analogy with the self-driving cars and that technology makes a lot of sense, because it seems that we're sort of at the similar stage of development with both of those, and they also seem the technology for both seems to be quite similar in many ways, and probably some of the obstacles are quite similar as well.
It's some of the similarities, right, are the ability to have a machine sense the environment, a very complex, cluttered environment with a lot of, strange things, right? So if you have a self-driving car navigating through urban streets, sure, you've got pedestrians and you've got other cars, but also you've got pedestrians doing odd kinds of things that might be unexpected. You might have road traffic. You might have construction or emergency vehicles. It's an uncontrolled environment. And so having a machine that can sense that environment and then understand it, to use a sort of an anthropomorphic phrase, right, but understand it enough to have a behavior for the machine to make a decision that you're comfortable with on the other side, right? When there are, for self-driving cars, life and death consequences. So that's very similar in that respect to autonomous weapons. What is different is the environment in warfare is even more uncontrolled, right? So the reason why self-driving cars work is those self-driving car companies have mapped the environment down to the centimeter. They know the height of the curb. They know where the stop signs are going to be and the stoplights. They know to look for the stoplight because they know where it is. They have GPS. None of that is going to necessarily exist in warfare. Your GPS might be jammed. You might be moving into an environment that you've never been into before. Maybe it's a city that used to be mapped, but the city's been demolished and the buildings are rubble and the streets are destroyed. And you have a competitive adversary that is trying to deliberately thwart your systems in a way that is not like, you get some of that behavior in driving, right? So, people cut you off or something, but people aren't trying to get into an accident, generally speaking. Whereas in the military context, you have an adversary that's deliberately trying to manipulate your systems. But I think the last piece that's really hard is you can take a self-driving car out into its real world operating environment to test it. So we could drive it around the streets, and the environment that you're getting, that's the environment we're going to deploy it into. That's not true for militaries, right? And so you could build an autonomous weapon and it works great on the testing range, and you've got all these target dummies out and it can identify them correctly. And then you deploy it into the real world and We don't know what wars we're going to fight in the future. We don't know where they're going to be. Got a pretty bad track record of getting that right. So, you're going to have different environmental conditions. You're going to have the adversary is going to act differently. Even the things that our intelligence might be observing them doing in peacetime, they're going to deviate from that in wartime, right? Because they know that we're watching, right? And so they might be using different kinds of maneuvers or different kinds of signals or different kinds of electromagnetic transmissions. So like there's a whole bunch of things that make it a really, really difficult problem to get right in wartime.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important, but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. Right. Well, there are a few wars that are currently ongoing, and I'd definitely like to talk about how autonomous weapons are being used in those conflicts, or if not, why. But I wanted to pick up on something that you said before, which is that we already have all of the technology for that. Or at least we have different parts of that technology already, but it's not really being put together and used as a whole. So why is that? Is it more because of the technical challenges of how difficult that is technically, or is it because of something else?
Well, it depends a little bit on the use case and how reliable you want your system to be. So this is where the type of target that the weapon will be going after matters quite a great deal. And so you can think about a couple different classes of military types of targets. One might be one that's emitting in the electromagnetic spectrum. So it's a radar, could be an air defense system that has a radar, could be a radar on a ship, and that's sending out a big signal through the electromagnetic spectrum. That's from a military standpoint, that's a really easy target to go after with an autonomous weapon because you know what those signals look like, at least in peacetime, that you can collect data on their frequencies and you can program that in and say, if you're finding this type of signal, go after it and steer towards it till it gets bigger until you hit something. And like, that's actually not complicated at all. That technology has been around since the 80s. And there have been a couple isolated cases of weapon systems that were designed to do this. A U.S. Navy missile called the Tomahawk anti-ship missile in the 80s, which was actually built and deployed. It was never, to my knowledge, used in combat, but had the ability to do this. You had to sort of know the direction the ship was in, but you would launch it then after a ship and it could fly a search pattern to hunt down enemy ships, designed and during the Cold War to go after Soviet ships. There's an Israeli system called the Harpy drone that goes after radars, but not really widely used. But that's a pretty easy target to go after. A more challenging one would be a military-specific object like a tank or an armored personnel carrier or artillery piece or a warship, aircraft carrier or destroyer, but that isn't emitting. But one that from like a visual classification standpoint is pretty easy to distinguish from other kinds of objects. That's, again, a pretty solvable problem. Image classifiers are over 10 years old now, and sort of if you have enough, you can take basically an image classifier, fine tune it on military specific images. You're going to have problems with you need a robust enough image database to deal with environmental conditions. So if you trained it, for example, let's talk about Ukraine, for example, right? If you trained it on images of Russian tanks in the summertime, well, in the wintertime, they're going to be covered with snow. And we know that image classifiers, they're not going to be able to adapt to that. But that's a solvable problem, right? You get a bunch of pictures of Russian tanks covered in snow and you put them in your database. So that's pretty doable actually today. I'm surprised we haven't seen more of that deployed, quite candidly. That technology is pretty solvable. We have seen some examples of Ukrainian drones that use image classifiers to identify objects. And there have been some like videos online showing Ukrainian drones flying over the battlefield. These have been around for a year and a half now, at least, if not longer. And image classifiers picking up objects, tank, person, truck, and identifying it. And so you can see immediately the value of that, particularly in an environment where the communications are being jammed. If I had to guess, it's probably not being used because a combination of there's people are being effective enough using remotely piloted drones, or sometimes now they're using fiber optic cables. They have other ways that are working that are less technologically complicated. They got to produce a lot of drones very, very quickly. And so, adding this feature in is, if it's not necessary, you're not going to do it. And if it goes after the wrong target, the collateral damage risk is less of a concern in that type of environment where you have very clearly established front lines, along in this geographic area, those are going to be Russian positions. So that's less of a concern. More of a concern might be that you're just wasting a drone, right? Maybe it doesn't attack a very interesting target or goes after a bombed out Hulk, or in particular, if it's a small drone, like where it hits on the vehicle really matters. So what they're doing with small drones to go after vehicles is individual pilots are piloting them in to then come in and hit the treads, for example, on the tank to blow up the treads. If it just hits anywhere, it'll bounce harmlessly off the armor, is not effective. So those might be like, and then there's again, people, depends on how discriminate you want to be. If you just want to that's a person, that's pretty easy. Image classifiers can do that. If you want to get to is that a enemy combatant? That's a trickier thing, right? Like what are the things you're queuing off of to say that's an enemy? You could do it in a geographic sense where, again, I'm not have knowledge of this being deployed, but you could in, say, Ukraine, where you just say anybody in this area who's a person, take them out. That's doable. That's definitely doable today. I'm not, to my knowledge, aware of that being deployed.
Well, we got to one of the main questions that was kind of puzzling me. Exactly why is it not being deployed already? And my assumption was that the tech is not ready, because if it was, I would expect it to be deployed quite widely, because I assume that the advantages of using it are mainly that, unlike with the current model where you need one soldier for one drone, so you're kind of limited in that sense, with the autonomous drones, you can kind of have unlimited amount of drones, and you don't need to have the same number of human soldiers controlling them. You're not putting those soldiers in danger because they don't have to be as close to the front line. And as you've said, that you don't have the same issue of carrying the signal between the operator and the drone itself. So you can just send them somewhere to do their job and not really care about that. So I guess it is. I'm still very much surprised that it's not deployed more widely, because especially in a war where both of the sides are kind of looking for any possible advantage to get an advantage over the other side. So that seems like something that would be achievable. And it is surprising that neither of the two sides seem to be using it. Or perhaps one thing that I'm thinking about now is that maybe they are using it, but it's not a public, for some reason they don't want to admit to it publicly. What do you think?
So, I mean, I wouldn't bet a lot of money that it hasn't been used. I think I'm confident that we're not seeing widespread use of autonomous weapons in Ukraine, because I do think that if there was a lot of use, we would know about it. There was a company maybe a year and a half ago that claimed that they had built a fully autonomous drone and that it had been used in combat. I've not seen any independent verification of this. When I was in Ukraine last year, I spoke at length with drone operators and drone developers and the Ukrainian armed forces and the head of their drones for their armed forces about, in general, how they're doing drones, but also in particular about this issue of autonomy. And a couple things stood out to me at the time. One was that most of the drones are remotely piloted. That is a big vulnerability because if you jam the communications link, it's not useful. And there's a lot of jamming going on. And so now we're seeing shifts to things like fiber optics. One of the things that I saw Ukrainian developers working on last year was what they were calling the autonomous last mile solution. And it was essentially, the military term would be autonomous terminal guidance. So the idea was that a person would fly the drone and to identify a target and then lock on to the target. And then from there on, the drone would take over and using its onboard software, steer the drone in to hit the target. And I saw it demonstrated out on a range against an old, hulk of an old bombed out Russian vehicle that a drone developer had used. The technology behind it's not complicated. It's pretty simple, actually. And you don't need a lot of hardware to do it. When I was there last year and spoke with Ukrainian drone developers, they were very keen to scale this up and to deploy this technology across the front. And I don't have a good fidelity. Sometimes it's hard to tell, unless you're like, I've not been back since, unless you're on the ground, like, exactly how much that's happening or not. So not, and if it's not, like, not clear what the obstacles are. One of the challenges in Ukraine right now is there's an enormous amount of drones being produced for the war effort, but it's very decentralized. And so that sort of allowed the country to tap into, their whole of society kind of ecosystem of engineers and entrepreneurs and people that are building drones in their garage and buying electronic components, online that they're getting from China and using 3D printers. But it also has meant that it's not necessarily the most it's not a top-down organized effort. And so, you might get, in some cases, solutions that are a little bit chaotic.
Right. But it kind of seems to me that even though it's not used right now at a mass scale, it's something that we will get to, probably even while the Ukrainian war is still going on. So while last year when you were there, maybe it was not really a thing, maybe a year from now, if you go there, it's much more likely that it will start to get more widely adopted. And maybe at some point it will become the majority way of doing it.
That would be my bet. I would suspect that we'll see. I mean, we're sort of in a gray area now where there've been a couple allegations of autonomous weapons use. I've not seen anything confirmed. I suspect that in the next 1 to 5 years, we'll probably see confirmed use of autonomous weapons at a small scale on the battlefield, and that will become more commonplace as time goes on. And some of it depends upon, like, some of these conflicts, like, say, the Ukraine war, how long it lasts. The longer the war drags on, the more that we're going to see this cat and mouse game of innovation in drones and counter drones.
Right. Well, one of those things that have always been a topic in the past, maybe before the war in Ukraine started, and this started to be used more in practice, was the I guess both ethical and practical concern of leaving out the humans out of making those decisions, basically outsourcing those decisions, whether to kill someone or not, to the machine. And that seemed like quite a big ethical question. But I guess from maybe what you have seen in Ukraine, is that a concern or not really? Because I assume that a lot of those questions that are maybe a big deal in peacetime, once you get to an existential war, they get resolved pretty fast.
Well, I think you're right. That's often what happens. And I tell this sort of anecdote in my book, Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War, about how after World War I, there was a lot of hand-wringing in the U.S. Navy about unrestricted submarine warfare, about submarines attacking shipping vessels that were used to ship cargo for the war for enemy nations. And right after Pearl Harbor, the next day, the Navy sent out an order to its Pacific Fleet execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. And so that's often what happens. And, a lot of this depends upon where you sit, right? And so if you're sitting in, a Western, like an NGO, humanitarian NGO in a Western European nation 10 years ago, then this idea of autonomous weapons and this seems so truly horrible and why would we do this? And it would be a curse on humanity. And I don't want to sound dismissive of the moral and legal and ethical issues. I think there are actually quite profound. But if you're a Ukrainian and you're trying to defend your country from invasion and you're like, well, I can put this little algorithm onto this drone and it's going to make it effective and this might help us win the war, you're like, yeah, maybe we'll sort out these ethical concerns. Like, what's ethical about your country being conquered and people being murdered? Like, that's not a good outcome, right? So I think a lot of it does depend on where you sit and how you're looking at the issue.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the same logic as with a lot of Eastern European and Scandinavian countries now abandoning their previous commitments to not use things like cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines. And when the danger becomes more real, those things become far less concerns become far less important. But maybe to better understand the concerns, both practical and ethical, that you spoke about with all of that, with outsourcing those decisions to machines or AI or however you want to call it. Could you make the case for why we should still care about that? Because to be perfectly honest, I think maybe myself, I'm quite cynical in that sense. And I think that I sort of fail to see why is it necessarily that much worse or that different if the decision is made by a machine rather than by a human. And it also kind of always seemed to me like that is just an inevitable progression that we would get to one day sooner or later. But if you would make the sort of the more cautious argument against that, what would that be?
Yeah. And to be clear, like there's validity to an argument that is, war is terrible. Let's not sugarcoat it. We should focus on weapons that are effective. Of course, they're horrible. That's the reality of war. But let me try to make the case for why I do think this is a significant issue, right? I think we could very well be on the verge of crossing a threshold in the next few years where we hand over decision-making about whom to kill in warfare to machines. And that would be a meaningful qualitative shift in humans' relationship with violence and war. And I think we should care about that for a couple reasons. One would be that the machines just might get it wrong. They might attack the wrong targets, attacking civilians. They might attack valid enemy targets, but in a place that makes that attack unlawful. So let's say, okay, that's an enemy tank, but it's parked right in front of a hospital. And by bombing that tank in that place with that size bomb that the autonomous weapon used, you killed, 1,000 civilians in a hospital. Was that really worth it to take out a tank? And that sort of concept under the law of war, is about sort of the principle of proportionality and military necessity. These are tricky issues for humans to weigh, but that could be a way in which machines get it wrong and cause excessive civilian collateral damage. Machines could also get it wrong by attacking valid enemy targets, enemy soldiers, but when they've already surrendered. And right under the law of war, once someone has surrendered, you're not supposed to attack them anymore. They're rendered hors de combat. They're out of combat. Similarly, if someone has been incapacitated, so not necessarily if they're wounded and they keep fighting, it's a valid enemy target. But if they're completely incapacitated, then they're not a valid enemy target anymore. And machines might get that wrong. And so you could lead to more suffering in war than would have happened otherwise had humans been making these decisions. You could even end up in a place where humans are nominally in the loop making these decisions. There's a person sitting in front of a computer, they're pushing a button, sure, go ahead. But they've effectively ceded judgment to the machine. Humans are not engaged in any meaningful capacity. And the human is there sort of purely as a scapegoat, effectively. Right? And so that would also be a problem in a couple respects, morally and potentially legally, depending on sort of how you view the law of war. Because you could lead to more suffering, and then you're sort of also just using this person as a scapegoat, right? Which isn't really acceptable. So I think there's a bunch of reasons to be concerned, and then that are sort of have to do with suffering and war. And the law of war is designed to try to reduce suffering. It acknowledges that suffering is part of war. It can't be reduced entirely. War is terrible, but there are rules in place to try to reduce civilian suffering and, in fact, enemy suffering also inside the ugly realities of war. So that could be one sort of set of problems. And then another set of problems surrounds what you might think of as stability in war. And you could imagine a circumstance where militaries have their weapon systems deployed short of an actual conflict, but there's a militarized dispute. Think of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's kind of the archetype of this. We haven't yet gone to war, but we're on the brink of war. Things are very tense. And right now, humans are the ones making decisions. For better or worse, humans don't always get it right, but humans at least have an understanding of the consequences of their decisions in those environments. And there's lots of examples in the Cuban Missile Crisis and other crises where you have sort of humans could have done one thing that might have been really dangerous, and they do something else. And they say, no, we're not going to shoot down that aircraft. We're not going to, elevate this false alarm. We're not going to use something else. And we're not going to fire on the enemy because we're on the brink of war. And if you pull out the human and put a machine there, the machine does not understand the consequences of that. And sort of the archetype of this is there was this incident in 1983 where there was a false alarm of a U.S. nuclear missile launch against the Soviet Union that was picked up by a Soviet early warning system designed to detect U.S. launches. The watch officer at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, identified it as a false alarm and didn't report it to his superiors. What would a machine do? The machine would do whatever it was programmed to do, whatever it was trained to do. And you could have a situation where machines escalate crises in ways that would be very inflammatory. And we've seen proof of concept of this in other areas, like in stock trading, where we've had flash crashes, where machines and algorithms are interacting in strange ways that lead to aberrant behavior that then we've had to try to find ways to tamp down on that behavior. We could do that in financial markets because we're regulators. There's no regulator to call timeout in warfare, which is a problem.
And you can also freeze the trading on the financial market at some point, and then until things get back to normal, but you can't really do that in war. Well, it seems that we've moved to a different level of warfare, because I think when we started talking, it was more in the sense of you have this one autonomous drones that you send somewhere, it goes somewhere, looks for a target, decides to engage it, attacks it, and that's it. And then I guess if we take a step back and look more at the strategic level, you have a different level of autonomous, maybe not weapons, but systems, where instead of just an individual weapon, it's a system that controls the command and control, and I guess starts to replacing the human soldiers that would previously get intelligence, analyze it, think about it, and then make some decisions and give orders. And at some point you might have a system that does that so much faster than humans, analyzes the intelligence, makes the decisions faster, better, smarter, more efficiently, and then gives an order to autonomous drones on the ground to go out and do something like that. And I guess that's would we talk about more when it comes to the escalation risk. How far away are we from that reality? And do you think that isn't it kind of inevitable, or that's what I always kind of come down to, is that just as much as the autonomous drones fighting on the battlefield are inevitable, the fact that the command and those decisions will be also carried out by AI systems seems also kind of like an inevitable reality to me as well. So what is your view? Am I right or not?
Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.